Hello and welcome to Read. Today I'm going to talk about The End of the Road by John Barth. The End of the Road is often paired or grouped with The Floating Opera, which is also included in this collection. And so I did read both of them. However, I felt like The End of the Road was such a better novel, to the point where actually I went in, I've talked about Barth on this channel before. I read Lost in the Funhouse and I really loved it. From what I've heard about the Sotweed Factor and Giles Goatboy, I know that I'm going to enjoy a lot of his stuff, and so I figured, okay, he's going to get the William Gaddis treatment of reading all of his books start to finish in order as much as I can, of course accepting Lost in the Funhouse. I'd say we started with a kind of rocky start with The Floating Opera, because I really had this strong impression while reading that book that it was a very reads Catcher in the Rye Once sort of novel, and I really just didn't think it was that good. It basically only it was a little bit hard to know whether we were meant to respond to the cynicism, nihilism of the main character, Todd Andrews, until about the last 10% of the book, at which point Barth seems to sort of show a progress or a development in it, to which I'm like, oh, okay, it's cool, but 90% of the novel is still more or less useless or not good. Anyway, moving on, fortunately The End of the Road was like just the same novel but a lot better, and so I'll give a general outline of what happens. I am going to spoil up to a point in the book, but I'm not actually going to spoil the final kind of climax of the book, because I actually think it's really entertaining enough and quite sort of surreal and interesting that it happened for a book that was written in the mid-1950s, that I am actually just going to leave it out. One interesting thing as well is that by pure coincidence, this exact copy of the book was owned by another YouTuber, Waste Mailing List, who is also a Sydney resident, and I believe I have some of his annotations in the book, which is kind of funny. It's almost like watching a movie with a friend who's like giving you just kind of pointing out things that they like in it. But yeah, that was kind of fun to go through and to see things that I highlighted that he didn't highlight, and vice versa. Anyway, the general outline of The End of the Road, we have a main character named Jacob Horner, and we actually have a really, really, I think, kind of cool, legendary opening line from Barth, which just establishes this kind of ambiguity. Simply, in a sense, I am Jacob Horner. And we end up getting introduced to this character. We find out that he's suffering from this weird version of paralysis, and it gets explained a little bit later on what's going on. He starts in this room, almost in an Infinite Jest style of like sitting in a room getting lectured by some sort of grand figure. In this case, it's the nameless capital D doctor, which is really cool. And the doctor is basically just telling him, you can't be idle. You need to go and do something. You need to, what can you do? Well, you can teach, English or teach grammar and composition. And so the doctor's like, all right, fine, go and teach that. And then he goes into Wicomico State's College in Maryland, and he starts teaching. Basically, he comes across this couple, Joe and Rennie, who are married. Joe is like a Scouts teacher. He's currently working on his PhD, and he kind of gets introduced to this relationship, and I'm going to read some extracts where he kind of gets into this sort of love triangle with them. And the interesting thing, or the really cool, rewarding thing about it, is that both of the characters are so sort of intellectually one step ahead that you get something as little as the first time Jacob or Jake meets Joe Morgan. He makes a little bit of a kind of sly remark, or just almost like a passing joke of him being in the Scouts or a Scouts leader. And then afterwards, when Jacob is out in his car about to leave, Joe kind of confronts him in a very meta way, in the sort of thing, in the way that like just kind of analyzing the conversation like from a third person perspective, in the way just using very untypical dialogue and untypical ways of talking. And what becomes really cool and kind of like, oh my gosh, just feeling like the book has so much forward momentum, is that they are so kind of intellectually on it, and Joe is so kind of fixed and rooted in his fundamental ideals, and the ideal being that, you know, in a relationship or in a marriage, the couple should be wholly and fully committed to each other and fully committed to respecting each other as a full unique entity. You get to the point where they're having kind of those meta conversations about conversations while it's happening. And even though I can tell that these books are not going to hold up as being anywhere near as good as some of Barth's later novels, something I liked that I heard Ruben at Readers It May Concern say was that these first novels are obviously signs of an author figuring out his voice, figuring out how he wants to write, but also authors who are an author who is more interested in the way of telling stories rather than what the story is. And it's not so stripped back to the point where you don't, like, it's not like a Beckett or a Markson where you don't have content in the story. But there are some times in this story where I feel like, oh wow, that was actually, I felt like a very Beckett sort of line. And yeah, from there, I think I'm actually just going to jump in. Well, essentially what happens is similar to, so in the floating opera, the interesting thing, or the interesting concept that Barth explores is cuckoldry and this sort of polyamorous and open relationship between Todd Andrews and the couple there. In this story, what happens is that they, even though the couple are fully committed, almost sort of reaping what he sows, or maybe even just kind of trying to do it and seeing what happens, Joe essentially sets Jacob and Rennie up to spend a lot of personal, intimate time together, and then eventually they have an affair. And what happens in a lot of the tension of the novel is Jacob and Rennie trying to figure out what caused the affair, and coming to just realizing that they keep coming to roadblocks, or more or less they come to the end of the road. They run their conclusions all the way to the end until like things just start to erupt. And the way that it erupts, I'm not going to say, of course, but yeah, that's something I like about doing these videos, is I think I'm liking this book a lot more than I did just by talking about it. But I'll read some extracts, which will be cool and hopefully give you a taste of what to expect. So this is the first thing, or this is one of the first cases of especially what I like, not just Joe and not just the male characters are given this sort of perspicacity in the way they converse, but also Rennie. So Joe and Rennie invite Jake, the main character, over to have dinner, and then he says, and he refuses. Jake says, I'd kind of planned on riding up to Baltimore this afternoon, have a look around, something came up. And Rennie just over the phone outright replies, oh, now, aren't you just getting out of it? Come on and say it. So we're not committed to each other. Don't be a chicken. It doesn't make a damn to us if you don't like us. And so just kind of confronted with this honesty, he's like, oh, okay. And then maybe he kind of gets a little bit more interested. He ends up, even though saying that, oh yeah, I'm not going to show up, he just magically shows up later on. And Joe kind of really forces this idea of sort of, you are what you do, and so whether or not you wanted to admit it, you did want to come to this dinner party with us. However, before that happens, there is a fun interaction where he does go out, he goes out driving to explore the town. He meets this woman named Peggy Rankin, and he she's a little bit older, but she's still, very kind of beautiful and very, very fit and attractive. But she also has this very clear way of sort of analyzing when he's not kind of acting or performing in the right way, where I'll actually just read the conversation. So, let's take your bathing suit off, Peggy. This injured her. You're in a great hurry, aren't you, Jake? Well, Peg, we're old enough not to be any sillier than we have to be. She made a noise in her mouth and, still holding my shoulders, pressed her forehead against my chest. By that, you mean I'm too old for you to bother being silly with, don't you? She observed. You're thinking that a woman my age can't afford to be coy. Tears. Everyone was digging the truth out of me. Why hurt yourself? I asked, over her hair to the whiskey bottle on the nightstand. You're the one doing the hurting, Miss Rankin wept, looking me square in the eye. You go out of your way to let me know you're doing me a favor by picking me up, but your generosity doesn't include wasting a little time being gentle. It doesn't make the least bit of difference to you whether I'm bright or stupid or what, does it? I might even be more interesting than you are since I'm a little older. This last piece of self-castigation, while it choked her completely for a moment, made her mad enough to sit up and glare at me. And then we go on a little bit further. It kind of dissolves, and Jacob, sort of observing the situation, says this. What she should have done, it seems to me, assuming she was after the same thing I was after, was assign me a role gratifying to her own vanity, say, the fresh but unintelligent young man whose body one uses for one's pleasure without otherwise taking him seriously. And then we could have pursued our business with no wounds inflicted on either side. As it was, my present feeling, though a good deal stronger, was essentially the same feeling one has when a filling station attendant or a cab driver launches into his life story. As a rule, and especially when one is in a hurry or is grouchy, one wishes the man to be nothing more difficult than the obliging filling station attendant or the adroit cab driver. These are the essences you have assigned them, at least temporarily, for your own purposes, as a tale-teller makes a man the handsome young poet or the jealous old husband. And while you know very well that no historical human being was ever just an obliging filling station attendant or a handsome young poet, you are nevertheless prepared to ignore your man's charming complexities, must ignore them, in fact, if you are to get on with the plot or get things done according to schedule. Of this, more later, for it is related to mythotherapy. And so mythotherapy is almost like a, kind of got like flash forwards or like proto kind of Myers-Briggs adopting these personalities, and even, Jordan Peterson talking about the things that he likes talking about. And one of the ways that we see that the kind of intense logic eventually kind of fails is that both of them have two seemingly obvious flaws, both Joe and Rennie. Rennie's is the much more obvious flaw, which is essentially that he resorts to physical violence in order to like really emphasize and make this point. And so he talks about this really messed up stuff about, kind of physically striking Rennie in order to reiterate to her that he's treating her as a full, complete human being and not making any concessions or anything, because he would physically strike anybody, not kind of pointing out the obvious fact of, like that you should just not strike anybody. But then with Rennie as well, we have some, what happens with her is that she essentially will get kind of flustered and get angry and shout and argue when she realizes that Jacob is kind of taking these side roads and not having, well, it seems to her, or she would criticize him as saying that he's taking these side roads and he's not kind of properly engaging in the logical argument. But it's because him coming from, this paralysis, this great indifference, this sort of emptiness or voidness, he knows how to ask questions and to make statements that kind of refute logic. It's really cool. It kind of almost harkens back to the young girl in the floating opera who just keeps asking why about everything. And Rennie's talking about when she kind of had the moment where she realized that she needed to commit kind of fully to Joe, because Joe's the only person who she thinks of as being kind of full and complete and pure, to the point where she even calls him God at times. And she says, I had to completely change my mind, not only about my parents, but about my whole childhood. I'd thought it was a pretty ideal childhood, but now I saw it was just so much cotton wool. I threw out every opinion I owned because I couldn't defend them. I think I completely erased myself, Jake, right down to nothing so I could start over. And you know what? The thing is, I don't think I'll ever really get to be what Joe wants. I'll always be uncertain, and he'll always be able to explain his positions better than I can. But there's nothing else to do but what I've done. As Joe says, it's all there is. And then next, so Jacob is kind of pushing her on this, being like, why though? And she says, first of all, everyone's personality is unique. Does it follow that because a thing is unique, it's valuable? You're saying that it's better to be a real Rennie McMahon than an imitation Joe Morgan, but that's not self-evident, Jake. Not at all. It's just romantic. I'd rather be a lousy Joe Morgan than a first-rate Rennie McMahon. To hell with pride. This unique personality business is another thing that's no absolute. And again, just kind of reiterating or emphasizing that this book was written in the mid-50s and we still, so aggressively sell individuality to people. And then kind of getting further into, one of the things I really love is that because, again, wow, I just keep loving this book more and more. This is interesting, but because Jacob teaches grammar, it's almost set up as this kind of theoretical or rhetorical, almost like an analytical versus continental philosophy kind of conflict, where Jacob is so, like, he's not about substances, he's about language and about movements. And of course, Joe and Rennie are, and Joe is just a fundamentally fully real thing that exists in the world, and Rennie is almost kind of caught halfway between. And then Rennie says, you know what I've come to think, Jake? I think you don't exist at all. There's too many of you. It's more than just masks that you can put on and take off. We all have masks, but you're different all the way through, every time. You cancel yourself out. You're more like somebody in a dream. You're not strong and you're not weak. You're nothing. I thought it was appropriate to say nothing. And here's where Jacob is sort of describing the paralysis that he's experiencing. It is the malady cosmopsis, the cosmic view that afflicted me. When one has it, one is frozen like the bullfrog when the hunter's light strikes him full in the eyes. Only with cosmopsis there is no hunter and no quick hand to terminate the moment. There's only the light. Okay, this is really cool as well. So Jacob has gone back to see the doctor again because Jacob has experienced another moment of paralysis, and the doctor is giving him advice on how to get out and how to not fall into this paralysis, which I think is just really absurd in the best way. And this is where I get a lot of the cool Beckett influence, where the doctor says, so he goes through this whole thing where he's talking about studying the World Almanac, take a day job, preferably factory work where it's not so simple that you're able to think coherently, blah, 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 don't get into relationships. And then he says, above all, act impulsively. Don't let yourself get stuck between alternatives or you're lost. You're not that strong. If the alternatives are side by side, choose the one on the left. If they're consecutive in time, choose the earlier. If neither of these applies, choose the alternative whose name begins with the earlier letter of the alphabet. These are the principles of sinistrality, antecedents, and alphabetical priority. There are others, and they're arbitrary, but useful. Goodbye. And this is probably the last quote that I'll leave you with. So, as I said, eventually they end up having an affair and they start to really degenerate. Joe is away from work for 3 days and he's essentially just like picking and really digging down to try and find out what caused the affair and why this all happened. And Joe confronts Jacob and says, don't you see, Horner, if you could convince me that very much of what Rennie did was under your influence, it wouldn't be good, because she shouldn't have been in the position to be influenced very much. And if you convince me that very little, if any of it was your influence, it still wouldn't be good, because by our picture of her, she couldn't have chosen to do it. So it's not like I'm trying to solve the problem by passing the buck. The thing is, I can't be sure just what the problem is that has to be solved until I know just what happened and why each thing happened. So yeah, it's almost like criticizing Joe's own emphasis, kind of his own paralysis, because whereas Jacob is kind of happy to be or unable to be partial to anything because he's kind of a nothing substance, Joe is like unable to acknowledge the obvious fact of, oh, this woman just had an affair and I am not happy with that. He just needs to find every piece of information before he can make a conclusion, which I think is its own form of paralysis. And yeah, like I said, the novel still has quite a bit to go. It kind of devolves in a really graphic way, which was so surprising. I would say that despite the slight hiccup of not loving the floating opera, I'm definitely come around to and have really enjoyed the end of the road, even just kind of talking about it a little bit more now. Let me know what you thought of the end of the road, and let me know how much I should be hyped for a future John Barth, because I already have, I think I already have like another 5 John Barth novels here, but I'm definitely just going to go through. I think I'll read The Saltweed Factor next, just when I eventually have time to read it. So thank you again for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.